Roger Maynard, welcome into the weeds. It's fantastic to finally meet you in person. I've been reading your works over and over again, and I'm just really looking forward to hearing from you because you're a broadcaster, journalist, foreign correspondent, author, and you really were at the eye of the storm when it came to one of the biggest crimes in Australian history, one of the biggest manhunts in Australian history, and that was the hunt, the capture, the conviction of Ivan Milat for the backpacker murders in the late 1980s and early 1990s. How did you come to be Johnny on the spot in Sydney and so involved from the very outset?
Well, it was quite accidental, really. There was a 2-paragraph story in the old Sydney Daily Telegraph afternoon paper reporting that 2 British backpackers, 2 girls, had gone missing and that people were concerned for their safety. And on the strength of that one short story on the inside pages, I rang up North Sydney Police who were dealing with it, and they said, well, you've got to ring this lady in Kirribilli, a lady by the name of Jean Jensen. Her daughter, Deborah, had employed one of these girls, Joanne Waters, as a nanny. And they'd got to know each other very, very well. She'd become part of the family. And I said to this lady when I rang up, Jean Jensen, I said, I'm just calling about the disappearance and what do you think's happened to the girls? And there was this long silence, uncomfortably long. And I thought at one point that she'd rung off, which people do when reporters ring them up sometimes. And then suddenly she came back and she said, something terrible has happened, something really terrible. So I said, what do you mean? So she said, well, these girls kept in regular contact with their parents back in the UK, and they've gone missing for 6 weeks now, and nothing at all has been heard of them, which is totally out of character. They used to ring their mum and dad every week or so and talk about their adventures and what they've been doing. And the parents were becoming increasingly worried about Joanne Waters and Caroline Clark. And eventually, the parents of Joanne Waters decided to come to Australia to try to assist the police in the hunt for the 2 girls. So they decided to fly here and go up the eastern seaboard of Australia, calling in at backpackers' hostels and fruit farms, anywhere where these girls might have worked or might have stayed for a time. And nobody at all had reported seeing them. And this was a real mystery. And I know Jean Jensen was very concerned herself because she'd lived in the country for a while herself. And she said, some of the people who get in the country are a little bit unsavoury. And so she really was worried about them. And nothing happened anyway for about 6 or 7 weeks. And I'd gone to the beach. I remember it was just before Easter in 1992. I'd gone to the beach on a Sunday afternoon. I was driving back in my car. Suddenly the phone rang. The mobile phone rang in the car, and it was Joanne Waters' dad. And he said, Roger, he said, they've found the girls. And that was it.
And he'd been put on to you by Jean Jensen?
Yeah, I got to know Ray and Jill Waters, Joanne's mum and dad, over the weeks. When they flew to Australia, I'd had dinner with them, and I established a good relationship with them. And when it's like many people, if their relatives or friends get into trouble on the other side of the world, they don't always know their way around, and if they see a fellow Brit, whether it's a reporter or anybody, they tend to become fairly close to them and ask them questions, this sort of thing. And this is what happened with Ray.
And it must have been just a horrendous experience for them searching this vast country for their daughter. And there was speculation in the press, wasn't there? At that point, it had started to bubble up, that there's been these disappearances, and not just 1 or 2, but a number. And so people had started to suggest that there was
But not at that particular time. It took some years afterwards, or weeks, months, years afterwards.
So this is before
anything had even been said about so-called backpacker murders. It was nobody had any idea what had happened to these girls. Little did they know that a serial killer was on the loose. And for a long time, the police weren't prepared to even discuss the possibility of a serial killer being responsible for these murders. And certainly the two girls, the death of the two girls obviously created quite a big police inquiry, but it was not until other bodies started being found, a year or two later or weeks later, that they realised that something, this was a much bigger case than they'd originally thought.
And so Joanne and Carolyn, the focus, like if I'm not incorrect, the police that told Joanne's parents that she had been found were King's Cross police. And if my understanding was that they actually told, like in a public place, like that they've found your daughter, or that we can't find your daughter. We think she's dead. That was sort of how it was handled. It wasn't handled very sensitively.
Well, I wasn't privy to those conversations. All I can talk about is what Ray Waters said to me on that Sunday afternoon. He'd obviously been told by the cops that weekend that these two skeletons had been found and that they believed them to be Caroline Clark and Joanne Waters. And they, obviously autopsies had to be carried out to confirm their identities, but they were more or less certain, I think, by what the girls were wearing at the time, that sort of thing, that these were the bodies of Joanne and Caroline. And he was obviously very, very upset, and his wife was terribly upset, as you can imagine. But at that particular point, I realised that this could become a very, very big story. It was already a fairly big story, even up until that point. But once the first two bodies were found, it became an even bigger story. And of course, once more bodies were found, then it became one of Australia's most terrible cases, criminal cases, and the hunt for a serial killer began.
And so you were writing for the Times and the Express, Daily Express in England. So you started filing on this issue.
Yeah.
One of the very first journalists to cover it, and you've subsequently written 2 books on it. Tell us about how the bodies were found, because it was just by pure chance, wasn't it?
Yeah, there were 2 runners going through the Belanglo State Forest on a Sunday morning, and they'd entered this wooded glade and smelt something. And they had a look round and they thought it was a dead animal. And then one of them found the remains of one of the girls under some leaves and branches in this wooded glade. And then a short distance away, they found the other girl as well. They were obviously very, very shocked by this discovery, and then immediately reported it to the police. But it happened in a very, very isolated part of the forest. It wasn't just a few hundred yards off the road. It indicated that whoever did this knew their way around the forest in great detail, and knew where to hide these girls, where they probably wouldn't be found, and they would just decay under the rotting leaves and branches and that sort of thing, and would never be discovered. So whoever did it was pretty aware of what he was doing and hopeful of not being found, I think.
But at that time, the 2 girls get found. There's no suggestion of like a serial killer, but it's clearly foul play, because the other bodies aren't found, are they? Ultimately, there would be 7 bodies found in the Belanglo State Forest. In actual fact, there's more since then, but at that time, the early 1990s, there were 7 found. But the first 2 British girls were found. But it was some years, despite the fact that the police were, of course, on this case. The other bodies weren't found for some years after.
Yeah, I mean, there were 3 Germans who were killed and 2 Australians who were killed. And it was some time after before the remains of these other travellers were discovered, roughly in the same area of the Belanglo State Forest.
But again, they were found by a member of the public, weren't they?
Yeah, people who were just hiking through the forest, that sort of thing. So it was an accidental discovery, certainly. And by then, of course, with 7 backpackers murdered, you had to take this case extremely seriously. And the police were under a lot of pressure to find whoever was responsible. This was quite they were very worried about the international publicity it was receiving coming up to the application for the Olympic Games.
Yes, Australia had just won the Sydney
right.
Olympic Games, and this was a massive part of Australia's tourism marketing, wasn't
That's
it?
right.
Come to Australia, backpack around this beautiful country, get out here, put a shrimp on the barbie, the whole thing. So it was undermining the tourism potential of Australia, but also the reputation of Sydney, because this was just south of Sydney, isn't it?
Yeah, it was harming the image of Australia, and certainly Sydney in particular, and of course the backpacker industry too, because at that time the backpacker industry was enormous. There were thousands, hundreds of thousands of kids coming from all around the world to Australia and living the dream, so to speak, and it overshadowed that element of the tourist business too. So the government, both the federal government and the state government, were extremely worried about the message that was being sent overseas by the discovery of all these bodies, and were very keen to solve it as quickly as possible. But they couldn't. They didn't know where to start. They had a number of suspects, obviously, but they didn't have any evidence or proof that any one person was responsible. And it wasn't until about 1994 that they had the big breakthrough, and that came in the form of Paul Onions, another British backpacker who survived the threat or the attack from Ivan Milat.
Well, we'll get to. I'd love to. We will talk about Paul, but let's just backtrack a bit. All of the people that ended up were murdered in Belangolo. They all had one similarity. They were all young backpackers. They were all travelling, and it's often said that they were hitchhikers, but it wasn't actually clear like where they were last seen or last picked up, was it? Like the a common set-off point for all of these backpackers was King's Cross, and some of them had said that they were heading out to Liverpool and to hitchhike down the highway, but they weren't actually seen on the highway or hitchhiking, were they?
No, they weren't. But it was common knowledge that backpackers would head for the Casula area of Western Sydney because the chances of not having to pay for your train fare was quite good.
Yep.
There was never anybody on the station there to actually check the tickets. So they would often head to Casula or that particular area of Western Sydney and join the Hume Highway there on the journey to wherever they were going, south, to Canberra, Melbourne, whatever the case might be. And so that was their favourite mode of travel, or their style of travel, before they were attacked. And this was reported quite extensively during the court case subsequently.
Because I know some of them had travelled, like had been in Australia a long time. I think Simone Schmidl had been in Australia a long time and had backpacked and hitchhiked all over the country. So it was very, very common at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, yes, thousands of people would do it all the time, but it was a major industry. There's no doubt about it. And of course, the kids, the young people, had their own tales to tell of what happened, the best places to go to, where to get money for fruit picking, what time of year to do it, and the best places to see and to visit. So there was not only a big tourism industry associated with the backpacker market, but there was lots of sharing of information about where to go and what to do.
And so an appalling part of this is, of course, the abductions and the murders, and there were clearly similarities in the modus operandi of the killer or killers in how these young people with their lives in front of them met their ends. These were some of the most brutal and savage murders in sort of modern human history, really, weren't they?
There were two modus operandi, if you like, when it came to the killing of these young people, either by stabbing or by shooting. And that was unusual to a certain extent for if it was one serial killer. Most serial killers adopt one method of killing their victim. To have two methods was seen as a bit strange, particularly if it involved a couple. And certainly in the case of Joanne Waters and Caroline Clark, one had been viciously stabbed to death and the other had been shot to death. So that did raise certain questions about whether more than one person might have been involved.
Because at the time and during the court case, it was preferred that there was by forensic psychologists that there was a strong suggestion that there could have been two people with different MOs operating in the forest.
Yeah, most certainly. And in fact, both the defence and the prosecution and even the judge in the trial conceded there was a strong possibility of another person, a second person, being involved. And there was a lot of evidence in support of that when it came to the ammunition they used, when it came to the guns that were used, and all manner of other little pieces of evidence that pointed to two people. So yeah, there was a strong possibility of a second person. Although I have to say that Clive Small, who was the police officer in charge of the investigation, always ruled that out. He was convinced it was just one person, and that one person was Ivan Milat.
And the murders themselves, there was a strong suggestion, but because of the decomposition of the bodies, that the people had also been sexually assaulted. There was a suggestion that that there'd been quite a length of time spent at these sites, including like fires and an increasing amount of time spent by the perpetrators at the site, and that the people may not have died very rapidly. In actual fact, there was sexual assault, but that could never be proven, but also torture and very in a way like a ritualistic killing in some of the instances.
That was one of the most horrifying aspects of the killings. There was evidence to suggest that one or two of the victims might have had their spinal cords cut and left there conscious, tied to a tree or something like that, and the killer went away and came back the next day to finish them off. A horrifying end, if you even could begin to imagine it. So yeah, I mean, there was evidence of possible sexual assault, and there was, certainly a lot of strong speculation at the time that sexual abuse had taken place in one form or another, and I think Joanne's bra was pulled up and things like that. I mean, little suggestions that they'd interfere with the corpse or the surviving person, the person before they were killed. So yeah, a lot of theories there. But again, it was largely speculation.
And in one of the murders, the corpse was missing its head.
Right.
The skull had been removed, and the judge had found that it was hot. Well, not the judge. That the police had found that it was impossible for an animal to have taken it. Someone may have taken that as a memento.
Yeah, because that skull was never found, and there was a suggestion, that. One of the victim who suffered this wound, had been the victim of a large knife. I mean, that was the only thing that could have executed the girl in that way. So yeah, there was certainly a lot of evidence to suggest from the knife wounds on some of the bodies that large, knives, carving knives, whatever the case might be, might have been used on them.
Truly horrific, and so a crime that exploded across the papers of Australia and the world. You must have been put under a lot of pressure to, get the story, get on the spot. Did you have to travel? Did you travel down to Belangolo to the location, and you must have been? It must have consumed you.
On a number of times. It was a story that did consume my life, certainly for the first 4 or 5 years between the first murders, between the discovery of Joanne and Caroline's bodies and Milat's trial in 96, I think it was. And then thereafter too, because there have been many other developments since then too, which have uncovered extra information. But yeah, it did consume my life, and you are under a lot of pressure on those sort of stories because there is a great hunger for more information, more detail, and slowly that sort of detail leaked out. One of the things I do remember, and I spent on several occasions, I spent visiting the forest. One of the most memorable moments was a few months after the bodies of Joanne and Caroline had been discovered in this wooded glade in the forest. Ray Waters, Joanne's father, and his wife decided to go back to Wales where they lived. But before they departed, they wanted to organise some kind of memorial to them, what they called a service of serenity. And it was held one Sunday afternoon in the middle of winter, 1992, cold, grey, wet afternoon, much like the Welsh valleys in where Ray and his wife had lived. And I remember going there, and it was such a hard place to find the exact spot where the girls were found. And there were quite a few people there, a few dozen people there, relatives, police, friends, other people who just wanted to wish them well and remember the girls. And I recall it was a fine drizzle, and there were a number of hymns sung, and it was a very, very emotional afternoon. And just as the final hymn was concluded, the sun came out above the canopy of the trees in this wooded glade, and a piercing light shone through the canopy of the trees right onto the spot where these girls' bodies were found.
Amazing.
It was really uncanny, to be honest, uncanny, and added to the emotion, of course. And that's one of the most memorable things I'll take with me from the Backpacker Murders, that really emotional afternoon. And then, of course, there were many other times after that where the Backpacker Murders kept on coming back into your life, and new developments. And then, of course, the coverage of the trial itself.
Deeply affecting, and we will talk about that a little bit later, about the sort of the emotional and personal cost of the work you have done. But at this time, this was, and viewers now would be surprised to learn this. This was when we were first learning that serial killers existed. This was in the 1970s and 80s, and sort of there wasn't a wide public consciousness that serial killers operated, and this was the first time really in Australian history that we had the police really out there acknowledging that we had this sadistic, psychopathic serial killer on the loose that had committed these egregious acts and was uncaught. And this is in late 1993. The pressure on the police to get their man must have been enormous. What happened then? The police responded. They formed this task force Air, headed up by Clive Small. It must have been a monumental effort, but there must have been a lot of stress involved in terms of the police to get something done and get it done quickly.
Yeah, and you must remember too that the police then, this was nearly, 30 years ago, or over 30 years ago or so, and the police didn't really have the technical backup that you'd have now when you're investigating a crime like this. Computers were still relatively in their infancy, and although they did use computer technology to try to analyse the suspects and the people who might have been responsible and cross-reference them and see where they were on that particular day, etc., it really wasn't. They weren't able to use the technology to the best. Let's say that, and they were still trying to find evidence in support of a suspect, of a suspect's involvement. And although Ivan Milat's name had come up, there was, again, no evidence at that particular stage that he was involved. And there were a lot of other people too, who might have had a dodgy past in one form or another.
I think the New South Wales government put out a reward for $500,000, and then I think they upped it, which was an enormous amount of money at that time. And they received thousands and thousands of phone calls, which would have just been an incredible amount of information to receive, evidence to potentially troll through. But there was some crucial evidence that the police did have, didn't they, from the actual site, because the killer or killers had left behind some really incredibly important evidence that ended up being absolutely fundamental to the court case, wasn't it? And that was spent bullets and also both the cartridges and the bullets themselves.
Yeah, there were a number of spent cartridges there, and interestingly enough, they came from different manufacturers, indicating that there might have been two people carrying different guns, using different ammunition. So that was an interesting point. I also heard on the grapevine, and I don't think this actually came up in court, but I heard on the grapevine that an empty bottle of booze was found quite near one of the bodies, and cigarette ends too. Interestingly enough, Ivan Milat never actually smoked or drank. which again suggested that another person might have been there. So yeah, there was a lot of small pieces of evidence that suggested that or pointed to a possible killer. But again, although the police had a lot of names and a lot of suspects and a lot of information, they were flooded with information, especially after that appeal by John Fay in the Belanglo State Forest and that big reward that was offered. Although they had an enormous amount of information that they were going through, I think probably they had too much information and they were simply overwhelmed by it all. And maybe they overlooked certain crucial points too. Certainly, in the first instance, they overlooked the information that had been provided by Paul Onions and his own experience. And there were, so that is not to belittle or underestimate the extent to which the police tried to carry out their work, but at the same time, it was a massive operation.
All done in the public spotlight. I mean, international media, yourself covering it. A high-stakes game, the Olympics potentially at stake. Australia's reputation as a place where you want to travel and you want your kids to come and travel. So the police set up their task force headed by Clive Small. They're receiving a lot of information, and a couple of names keep coming up. The Milats, a big family from southwest Sydney, who had a reputation. Their name kept coming up again and again, didn't it? And tell us a little bit about the Milats.
Well, the Milats were a big family, a lot of children in the family, and they came from Eastern Europe originally. The father, and they did have, some of them anyway, did have a bit of a criminal background. And certainly Ivan had a criminal background. He was known to have been stealing cars in his youth. And there was also a rape case that he was involved in.
That's the key breakthrough, wasn't it? Because they were known as, people who sometimes operated outside the law. And they were also well known for their liking of firearms as well. That was a key component of who they were. But the big breakthrough was in terms of the task force when they established that Ivan Milat had been charged but not convicted for a previous offence.
Yeah, and it went back to the early 1970s, and no one had really bothered to look at previous offences of Ivan Milat until some time into the investigation. And then it was discovered that he'd been involved in a case involving two young women, down the Hume Highway. And he allegedly raped one of them and eventually let the two girls go. He then got arrested, and when he eventually appeared in court, he was found not guilty. Partly because the evidence didn't stack up in one form or another. It was suggested, you certainly couldn't say this now, but it was suggested at the time that one of the girls was on for it, if you like, to use a term, and that she didn't, protest as much as she might have done.
And also that she was gay, which at the time was an offence, wasn't it?
That's right, it was too.
So she was a lesbian.
Ivan Milat couldn't believe his luck when he got off this charge. And,
what's incredible too, I've been doing some reading about that. What's incredible is he was actually acquitted of the rape, the abduction and rape charges 4 days after he was acquitted of 2 armed robbery offences as well, because he had been involved in 2 armed robberies with his brother, who went to jail, I think, for 18 years, and he was acquitted of those as well. Because he had been arrested and charged with these offences, bailed, and he faked his own suicide, didn't he?
Well, I mean, this is all a bit lost in the mists of time, to be honest. I mean, there's not a lot in the public record about that particular area or time within Milat's life. So it's not something I can sort of go into in great detail. But certainly the police knew that he had background, he had criminal offences behind him, and that, although he'd ostensibly tried to keep himself clear of the law for nearly 20 years, that he'd been up to no good in some form or another. We also knew that Milat, like many of his brothers, loved hunting and shooting. They loved going out kangaroo shooting, and they had a number of guns, which allowed them to do so. And so that, in many ways, it was quite easy for them to get the ammunition and the arms to actually go out and kill wildlife, and in the case of Ivan's case, to eventually graduate to killing humans.
It's fascinating. And so that was a key breakthrough for the investigation. Detective Paul Gordon had established that one particular person of interest, Ivan Milat, had this history. He also lived in that southwest Sydney area. He was in Guildford. He had the opportunity. So Ivan Milat was working on the roads, wasn't he? So he was someone who was working for the Roads and Transport Authority, like the Department of Main Roads, working on the roads, travelling in that area. He also had the opportunity, didn't he?
Yeah, certainly he would often go to areas outside of Sydney and spend weeks with the Department of Main Roads, working on the highway. Sometimes he went to Newcastle, sometimes he went south, sometimes he just stayed in the suburbs of Sydney. And often he would go away for days at a time, stay in a motel, and then come back at the weekend to his home in Fairfield and eventually Campbelltown, of course. He certainly had the opportunity to go out and find people, if you like. And often it was established during the court case that, he'd been in the particular areas where some of his victims were known to have been as well, working in that area,
One of the interesting things that reading through the transcript of the court case and Paul Onion's testimony is that Paul Onions wasn't actually hitchhiking when he was picked up by Milat, was he? He was approached by Milat.
This is one of the most extraordinary stories of the backpacker case. Paul Onions was trying to...
So tell us who Paul Onions is.
Yeah, Paul Onions was a young backpacker, lived in the Midlands area of the UK, come out here by himself and was going to travel around. Ordinary guy. And he decided to go down to the highway, the Hume Highway, and travel south. Again, he'd gone out by train, I think, to Casula, and he'd gone into the local newsagents at Casula to ostensibly buy a can of soft drink. And at that particular point, quite coincidentally, Ivan Milat came in as well. And they got chatting as they queued up at the counter or wherever. And Paul said he was going south. Ivan said, "Well, do you want a lift? I'm going south too. I'm travelling." So Paul Onions couldn't believe his luck. Here was an opportunity to get a lift without having to hitch or anything like that. So he agreed to travel with Milat. They both got into his four-wheel drive, which was parked outside the newsagents in Casula, and off they went. For the first half hour or more, it was a very jovial conversation. They were talking about their backgrounds. Ivan talked about his own family's background, heritage, if you like, and the sort of job he did, and Paul the same. I think he'd worked in the military for some time, and Ivan was interested in that as well. Eventually, they got to the Southern Highlands, approaching the Southern Highlands anyway, and they'd been listening to the car radio, and suddenly Ivan decides to pull over, park his car by the side of the road, and Paul thinks it's a bit strange. So Ivan justifies this by saying, "Well, look, you tend to lose the radio signal out here this far. I'm going to get some cassettes from underneath my seat." So he got out of the car, pulled up the front of his seat, ostensibly to find these cassettes, and revealed not only a coil of rope, but a revolver. And at this point, Paul Onions realised that his life was in danger. This wasn't this wasn't looking good, if you like.
It wasn't a cassette.
Certainly wasn't a cassette, no. So Paul Onions moves to get out of the car. Ivan, on the other side, says, "Stay where you are. I'm not going to kill you. I'm just going to rob you."
He's got the gun.
Got the gun, yeah. And Paul Onions realises it's now or never. He's got to get out of that car and run for his life, otherwise he's a dead man. So he opened the door, virtually threw himself on the main road. This is the busy Hume Highway, don't forget. A lot of cars,
This
a lot
is
of
the
traffic.
main arterial route between Sydney and Melbourne.
Exactly right.
This is one of the busiest highways, but it's still not. It's still like there's traffic travelling, but it's infrequent. But it's certainly not a remote location.
No, that's right. And of course, Paul Onions then runs for his life, and he's zigzagging down the road. By this time, Ivan is following him. He's shooting at him, and
Because Onion was a military man. He'd been in the Navy.
that's right. He had, yes.
So he zigs and he zags, and Milat's shooting at him on the highway.
That's right. And remarkably, even though Onions is trying to flag a motorist down to give him some means of escape, nobody stops. And
What a nightmare.
exactly. So here he is on the central reservation of the highway, trying to get out of Ivan's way. Ivan's gradually catching up with him. And in a last-ditch attempt, Paul Onions sees a people mover car coming towards him. And he says, well, I'm either going to have to be shot by this guy or I'm going to be killed in a road accident. So he threw himself into the path of this oncoming people mover, much to the alarm of the woman driver. And he races up to the side of the car and says, please help me, let me in, let me in. This bloke is trying to kill me. Well, the woman had several kids in the back of her people mover and was in no mood to get involved in such a potentially dangerous incident. Anyway, at this particular point, Ivan realised the game was up. And he stopped and he started walking back, putting his hand into his jacket pocket to hide the revolver. And the woman realised that the guy had given up, and so she opened the door and let Paul Onions inside. Now, what happened after that is equally intriguing.
So, and Paul Onions had left his backpack in the car. He had run to this car. And for me, what's striking about this is that Milat attempts this abduction on the highway. Like, he's just stopped. He's not in a remote area. Cars are going past. He's going to abduct and potentially murder this man on the side of the highway. And then he's standing on the highway shooting. Just supreme arrogance and indifference. Remarkable, isn't it? It speaks of a man who just felt like he could get away with anything.
He thought he was untouchable, and that's because he did get away with so much.
Yeah.
He got away with the rape case and all the other, many other things too. And at that point, he hadn't begun the 7 backpacker murders.
And this is really important because this is in 1990, and 5 of the 7 backpackers hadn't been murdered yet.
That's right.
So Paul Onions and I forget the woman's name, but in the car with the kids head to Bowral Police Station and they make a report, don't they?
That's right. They go to the police station. There's only one officer on duty, I think, and she takes a note of what happened. But remarkably, the attack is not followed up. The notes end up in the police officer's notebook and are put somewhere safe and quietly forgotten about. Nobody attempts to follow up the attacker, even though they have a lot of information about his identity, the car he was using, and his name.
So Paul Onions the image of Ivan Milat would be ingrained in Paul Onions' mind. Milat was a striking figure. He wasn't a tall man, but he was very fit. Was famous for being very, very strong, muscular, and he had a striking Merv Hughes style mustache. So that would have been some details, and Paul Onions was able to give the details of Milat's car as well, which was particularly unique as well.
Yeah. It was a 4-wheel drive, and he thought that there was a spare wheel on the back, and he remembered the colour and the detail of the car very, very clearly. Anyway, he thought he'd got out of this situation alive. He was thankful for that, and he carried on his travels.
Did you ever talk to Paul?
No, Paul Onions was very reluctant to talk openly about what had happened. I only remember listening to him in court and him detailing his very vivid and traumatic story. That was one of the most extraordinary testimonies I think I've ever heard in a court case.
Well, let's backtrack and fast forward, in actual fact, at the same time, because so Paul Onions becomes a critical player. We're back in 1993. The police are asking the community for information. It's flooding in. They're beginning to narrow down their suspects, the Milats. So both Ivan and potentially Richard Milat and Wally Milat and some others are being named. And Paul Onions reaches out and says, in actual fact, this happened to me and I made a report on it to the Bowral Police Station. So the investigators have got that to go and find, don't they?
Yeah, but it didn't happen quite as quickly as that. Paul Onions was back in the UK by 1993. He'd gone back to work, but he was reading the international coverage of what had been going on in Australia.
Probably reading your reports.
May well have been. But certainly he would have been aware that a lot of backpackers had been killed.
And he says, hold on.
Maybe it's the same person.
Yep.
And he thinks, well, I better get in touch with the cops or the authorities and tell them what happened to me to see if there's a connection. So he didn't really know where to go, first of all. He rang Australia House in London. And they said, well, you want to really talk to the police direct. And they gave him the telephone number of the police authorities in New South Wales. And he tried to make a call. He spoke to somebody. They never rang back. They never followed it up. And some weeks went past. He decided to have another attempt. Again, no one really seemed that interested in what had happened to him. But on the third attempt, he got through to a police officer who was certainly a bit more canny, if you like, and he realised that this could be an important piece of information. And that police officer followed up the details that had been given by Paul Onions at the Southern Highlands Police Station, and they eventually found the report, the original report, and they had a lot of information at their disposal as a result of this about the identity of whoever attacked Paul Onions and the sort of car he was driving too. So suddenly they had a much clearer picture of who they were looking for, and that's when they started going in the direction of Ivan Milat or his family.
Because the description of this man fitted Ivan Milat, the car loosely, but the physical appearance, the moustache, where Ivan Milat was known to frequent, that southwest Sydney, Liverpool area. So that's a red hot lead. He clearly becomes the person or one of the clear people of interest. He goes under observation. So it must have been critical for the police, with all that political and public pressure, to make sure that they didn't tip Milat off.
That's right. But before we get to that particular point, the police in New South Wales decide to bring Paul Onions to Australia.
Yes.
To identify the person who they thought might have done this. And Paul Onions was really reluctant to come, partly because he thought he might have been set up in some way or other, that it may not be the police he was talking to, but that it could be somebody with some kind of criminal intent. And he was really worried. When he stepped off the plane at Sydney Airport, he still wasn't quite sure what was going on.
Really? He thought there could be some massive intrigue and conspiracy, and he could be being set up.
Yeah. Anyway, fortunately, the story was true.
Courageous man.
Yeah, it really was. And then, of course, he was shown in a photo book of possible suspects, and he immediately identified Ivan Milat as the man who picked him up.
And so Milat goes under observation. The police begin to prepare to arrest Milat. Tell us about that period of time. Like, you must have been, the whole community must have been on tenterhooks. You must have been keen for the scoop on who it was. When did you first learn the name Ivan Milat?
Well, I hadn't known the name Ivan Milat until shortly before his arrest. It was kept very, very closely to the police. The police obviously had their suspicions, but it certainly wasn't public knowledge, and certainly very few, if any, journos really knew about the person the police had got their eyes on. So it wasn't until the very morning of Milat's arrest that it became public knowledge the identity of the person who was being arrested for the backpacker murders.
That they had someone, that they were going to they were going to raid properties, they were going to make arrests. Were you there, or did you have to get out of it?
No, I wasn't there. But even at that stage, the police were not 100% convinced that he was the right man, because they had no evidence at that particular stage that he'd taken part in these.
Because they were arresting him for the abduction of Paul Onions.
Right. Yes, indeed.
And that gave them the reason to then raid and search Milat properties.
And then, of course, when they entered the house, there was an Aladdin's cave of evidence suggesting that he was part of the murders. And then, of course, subsequently, more evidence was found in the homes of some of his relatives as well.
Now, let's talk about that, because it is, again, like, remarkable. This fellow who's prepared to abduct people in broad daylight, shoot at them, clearly murder people. Ultimately, he's been convicted of murdering people, abducting them over a long period of time. His house is as you say, an absolute Aladdin's cave of evidence. Talk about what that evidence was, because there was evidence that was, although circumstantial, it was ultimately compelling.
Yeah, well, the biggest find, of course, was the Ruger rifle, which was hidden within the wall cavity of Milat's garage out at Campbelltown.
And just on that, like, my reading have informed me that Milat had some suggestion that he was a person of interest. Like, everyone in Australia was talking about the backpacker killers, and Milat had been tipped off that he may be a person of interest. He had gotten rid of some evidence, had he not, to his brother's place, but clearly not all.
No,
which is a remarkable thing to think that you might, like, if you were guilty of it, that you would not. The arrogance, the sense of being untouchable, is just amazing. He doesn't get rid of the evidence. No, he's got the rifle in his cupboard, in his wall cavity.
Yeah. And of course, he'd given backpacks and cameras and other belongings associated with the backpacker victims.
So they were from the victims to family members.
Yeah. So he'd done that, but he'd also got a pretty good idea that the cops were after him, because for the days preceding his arrest, there'd been police helicopters circling his house. And there were lots of unmarked police cars in the vicinity too. And so he got a pretty good idea that the cops were closing in, even days, if not weeks, before the actual arrest. And as you rightly say, when they got into the house, they couldn't believe their eyes. And when they found the Ruger rifle, which was used in the killing of some of the victims, they just thought, well, this is extraordinary.
Because the ballistics matched up.
Yeah,
they had found ballistics at the site, but they'd also been to a firing range, and they were able to pin down the maker of those bullets, the batch numbers, and also the ballistics as well.
But more than that, they were able to establish that the Ruger rifle left a noticeable scratch on the cartridge when it was fired
From the particular firing
from
pin.
that particular gun. Yeah, that rifle, and so they were able to retest the Ruger rifle eventually to see whether it also made a mark on spent cartridges, and it did. So they knew that this was certainly the same rifle that had been used on some of the victims.
So they literally had not the smoking gun, but they literally had the gun found in his wall cavity. But there was other evidences too, because it's a common theme with a lot of these psychopathic killers. They keep mementos. It's about power, being able to relive it. He kept this extraordinary number of mementos, including clothing, backpacks, and he gave them to, like, his girlfriend and family, etc., didn't he?
They were trophies, in effect, and they were reminders of the control he had over people and what he could do to people. And so, yes, there were items of clothing. There were T-shirts belonging to one of the girls. and all manner of little artifacts, which he'd taken from the scene of the crime and either kept in his own house or then given to some of his relatives to hide.
And one of those was a pillowcase that included like bindings, wasn't it? And there was DNA evidence that was able to be extracted from that.
Yeah, there were sash cords, which had blood on them, and that blood had ostensibly come from Caroline Clark, and they were able to match the two. And so,
because this was in the early 90s. This is when DNA evidence was in its infancy.
Yes.
Someone probably wouldn't think that they could get caught by that. Someone like Ivan probably didn't think he was going to get caught. But again, a truly compelling piece of evidence.
Yeah,
caught, but found in his own house.
Yeah, indeed. And there was a proven link between those sash cords and Caroline Clark.
Extraordinary. So Milat is arrested, and I've read the transcript. I think it's in your book, actually, of the arrest, which is extraordinary. Where he's phoned by the police and told, get out of bed, and he's just so nonchalant. Like they say, the tactical response group's outside. He looks out the window, says, "Oh, I can't see you." They say, "Come outside and lie down by the gate," and he says, "I don't have a gate." He's just completely nonplussed. But ultimately, he comes outside, surrenders to hundreds of police and media and the rest, and is taken to Campbelltown police station. It must have been an absolute circus.
Yeah, it was a circus. A huge number of police there, of course. And I think one or two of the TV companies had cameras there as well. So, yeah. But Milat's ability to face the reality of his arrest over this terrible crime and his calm composure defies belief almost. And again, I think he felt that he would get off. He felt that the police wouldn't be able to pin it on him, which is a mark of his supreme confidence, if you like, in his abilities. So yeah, I mean, he was just a character who did not accept reality and certainly wouldn't be responsible for his actions at all. But the very fact that he actually stayed in bed for some minutes while the police were banging on his door, acting in a very calm manner in his own home, suggests that he wasn't worried about the arrest.
Yes, it's an interesting point. Did he feel that he would get off, or did he feel protected in a way? Maybe those offences he'd committed in the early 70s had been, instructive to him. He thought that maybe, well, look, I've been here before. I'll beat this, but which would be a remarkable thing to think when your house was full of guns, clothing, blood-stained cords. Amazing, like you would have to be truly insane, which potentially I think he was, to believe that. But he ends up in Campbelltown Police Station. He reaches out through his sister to his lawyer, John Marsden.
Yeah.
His lawyer, John Marsden, who had defended him again in the 1970s. Marsden appears in court. He's seeking bail, but no bail for Ivan.
No, that's right. And I think that's where the relationship between Marsden and Milat deteriorated, because up until that point, I think Milat had great faith in Marsden, partly because Marsden had got him off the rape case 20 years earlier. But at that point, he began to doubt Marsden's ability, and I think they had a bit of a row, and that's when he sacked Marsden. Interestingly enough,
that was during these committal hearings about whether or not it was just a magistrate in the local court hearing the committal hearings as to whether or not there was going to be enough evidence to stand up. Yeah. It was circumstantial, but ultimately it did proceed to a full trial.
Yeah, and there was this all took place in Campbelltown Magistrates Court, a fairly small court in the western suburbs of Sydney. But I remember there was enormous interest among the media to get a seat in the press gallery there and to follow the trial. And so it was obviously had a great deal of importance. It was regarded as a very important news event. But Milat just took it in his stride. And I remember watching him intently, not just during the committal proceedings, but also during the trial as well. And
well, let's talk about the trial, because he ends up. There's committal proceedings. He ends up being on remand. He's detained. It's going to go to court, but that's not for some years. It takes a while for that to for the police to prepare their case, the defence to prepare their case, because Milat struggled to find a lawyer, didn't he?
Yeah.
And so it wasn't until 1996 that there was actually a full court case.
That's right, in the early part of early part of 1996, yeah.
So tell us about that, because that must have been fascinating. Because for you, like, you're covering it, you're sitting in the court. You're sitting in the court, literally a few meters away from Ivan Milat on a daily basis. Tell us about that experience and what happened in the trial.
Well, Ivan Milat never established eye contact with anybody in the witness box, and he certainly didn't establish eye contact with anybody in the press bench. But I remember sitting only a few feet away from him. No.
Always just looking off into space.
You what, he reminded me of, he could be, the man sitting in that in the dock could have been everybody's favourite uncle. He had that slight sort of grin on his face, someone who could appear to be, fairly amenable, but he kept himself apart from what was going on. He studied everything that was being said. I remember one occasion when one of the witnesses appeared in the witness box and who had been a friend of Joanne Waters, and she strode to the witness box and put a photograph of Joanne on the top of the witness box on the wooden shelf to remind her of what this case was all about. And I looked at Ivan when this happened, and he couldn't bring himself to look. He couldn't bring himself to look at the witness or the photograph. He just stood looked directly ahead of him at the judge, and that was all. There was no emotion, no hint that he'd been involved or he was emotionally involved in what was going on at that particular stage of the case.
So the evidence is the prosecutions led by Mark Tedeschi, SC. The evidence is circumstantial, but it is compelling, and it's Paul Onion's evidence and the evidence in terms of the material evidence found at Milat's house and his brother's properties. That was the most compelling part, wasn't it? Ultimately, that led to Milat's conviction.
It did. But also, we should remember that Milat did give evidence in court too. He was cross-examined, which perhaps was not well advised in his case. And I remember it was a startling few seconds when Mark Tedeschi was interrogating Milat in a real staccato fashion. Bang, bang, bang. What about this? Bam, bam, bam. Question after question after question, in the hope of tripping him up. And there was one particular question. He said, but what about the gloves found in your car, Mr. Milat? And Milat came back, who was used to replying quickly to every question. He said, I was not. And he suddenly stopped himself. And Tedeschi says, were you about to say, I was not looking for my gloves? As though that might incriminate him. And he said, no, I was going to say something else. But Milat was obviously flustered at that particular point. He realised he was at the brink of conceding something that might give the prosecution extra ammunition. But yeah, I mean, the prosecution did have a lot of evidence at that stage. And of course, the defence, worked it to their advantage in some respects, because they say, look, we've established that a lot of the things found at the scene of the crime, illustrated or suggested there were two killers, and that one of them might have been Mr. Milat's, a member of Mr. Milat's family. And if you accept that, you also have to accept that Ivan Milat wasn't there at that particular time.
Which is extraordinary, because the defence was essentially throwing some of Ivan's family under the bus, but was also relying on them in different areas to provide alibis, like on where he was and wasn't on particular days. Because I think a key date was Boxing Day in 1991, when Joanne and Carolyn Clark went missing. There was a suggestion that the family were giving him an alibi, but they couldn't really establish it because they didn't have photographic evidence. But these were family members who were saying, yes, we took these guns from Ivan on one hand. Yes, he told me I want to hide all these guns, and he gave me the backpack, which was incredibly incriminating. But on the other hand, saying, oh, well, he didn't do these ones these murders because he was with us on that day, which is an extraordinary turn of events, really.
Yeah, I remember that piece of evidence about the Boxing Day meeting, and they'd all gone round to the mum's house in Fairfield, and they'd all celebrated Boxing Day, Christmas at the house. And said, well, Ivan couldn't have done this because we were with him at the time. He was playing with his relatives' kids on the floor, playing cars and this sort of thing. So they certainly tended to substantiate the defence's case that Milat wasn't out there wasn't involved in the killings on that particular day. But did he disappear sometime later in the day? And as there was no photographic evidence of that celebration in the house, then there was no real proof that he was there at all, or during later on in the day.
So the matter's not being heard by a judge; it's being heard by a 12-person jury who hear all this just shocking evidence. It must have been truly appalling to be walked through the evidence on how these young people were abducted, how they met their deaths. The family members are in the room. There must have been an incredible toll on all of those who were involved in hearing that ghastly evidence in granular detail.
Yeah, I mean, there was really bloody evidence, if you like. And I remember too, for whatever reason, the prosecution decided to put the shirt in which Joanne Waters was stabbed in front of the court, in front of the jury. The shirt with all its tears in, where the stab marks had been made, where the knives had entered her body. And that was on display for quite a long time.
Because some of these people met their deaths in the most gruesome ways, stabbed in the front and the back and tortured, and that must have just been horrific.
Well, certainly. I mean, it would have been almost certainly a prolonged death certainly if they'd been one of the stabbing victims. Maybe with the shooting victim, they'd been shot, and the first bullet had killed them. But who knows? So much we still don't really know about this case and what happened at the scene of the crime, although we have a fairly good idea.
Yes. So the jury retires. They retire. They're locked up. And one of the key things was there'd been so much media attention. I think the defence had said, look, they're not going to get a fair trial with a jury trial. We'd prefer it was heard by a judge. That's rejected. Ultimately, it's a jury trial. The jury takes 3 days and they come back with a verdict. But in the intervening period, as they were heading off, one of the jurors receives a death threat.
Yeah, this was very interesting, and it was revealed there was an adjournment of the case, and no one could quite understand why it had been adjourned. The media, the public were forbidden to be in court at that particular time, while the judge discussed something with the prosecution and the defence. What we later learned had happened was that one of the jurors had been coming out of his home that morning on his way to court. The phone rang at home, and somebody on the end of the line said, "You better find him not guilty."
Really amazing.
Now, who was that person? We never established who that person was, but it was enough to worry the judge and the defence and the prosecution, because it looked as though there was a possibility the case might have to be aborted, or the trial might have to be aborted.
Because that could have,
that particular time.
Well, that clearly could. Well, that person was saying it wasn't going to influence them, but that could have happened to the other jurors as well.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Anyway, what happened was that the juror agreed to stand down, and the case proceeded with just 11 people on the jury.
Ultimately, the jury came back, and what did they find?
Guilty on all charges.
So there was the 7 murders and the attempted abduction of Paul Onions.
That's right. Yes. Even though it took them 3 days or more to decide, they were pretty certain of the evidence, I think, and in no doubt of his guilt.
And so Milat is found guilty by a jury of his peers, and he's sentenced to, what was it? I think it was the term of his natural life plus 8 years or something up to that, locked up forever. What was the sense amongst the family? Like it must have just been so bittersweet to but I suppose some relief to have some justice.
Yeah, utter relief, I'd say. Utter relief that he'd been found guilty and that someone was responsible for, we knew who was responsible for the deaths of their children. And don't forget that they'd gone through an horrific stage in their lives, 4 or 5 years of knowing what had happened to their kids, going through the court cases, going through the pre-trial hearing and the trial, and they were at their wits' end, really. I mean, they were really traumatised by the whole thing. I remember particularly Joanne's mum, Jill Waters. I remember going out to dinner with her one night. It was impossible to have a conversation with her because she kept on breaking down in tears all the time.
Awful.
Awful. It was just terrible what had happened. And the other thing you notice after sitting through the trial is that so many people were affected by these crimes. It wasn't just the families of those who died. It was all the many people who came into contact with these girls at some time or other, who knew them, met them on the road maybe, at a fruit farm, or, knew them from their school days. But
Employed them as a nanny.
Yeah, the nanny, exactly. And there were literally hundreds of people whose lives had been affected personally by these attacks, by these murders. And when you look at it in that respect, you realise the full scale of the horror that Ivan Milat committed.
Well, it must have affected you, but like straight after the trial, we'll get to that, but straight after the trial, you knock out a book. Like
Yeah.
you were the first person to write a book on Milat in the world. I mean, it must have taken a toll on you, and you've updated that book, and I've just been reading that again. It must have, tell us about the personal toll it must have taken on you to have Ivan Milat living in your head for a while.
I think you in those.
And how have you dealt with it? Because
well,
you seem happy and unaffected, but it must have taken its toll on you.
Yeah, obviously, you're very, very. You can get emotional about it when you hear that sort of evidence, but you always have to maintain a degree of professional detachment. It's like an ambulance officer or whatever. When they go to a terrible accident, although you're affected by it, you've got to remain detached in some way or other. Otherwise, your life will be ruined. So yeah, you've got to maintain that professional detachment, but that does not mean to say that you're not affected emotionally by it. And certainly, writing the book, I was writing the book in conjunction with reporting on it and going to the case every day. And so it overwhelms you, it really does. You don't think of anything else. And you wonder, I had a number of strange things happen to me which always got me a bit suspicious about whether I was being got at in some way or other, whether there's somebody after me. I kept on receiving phone calls that there was nobody on the end of the line. And one day my literary agent said, on the day that Ivan Milat was sentenced, she rang me up in a panic and said, "Roger, there's a car keeps on going up and down outside my house, and I'm worried someone knows where I live." And I thought, calm down. And you did have to calm down. There was a sense of paranoia about the case and the end of the case, and whether other people might be out there who might want to get at you in some way or other. Now, I think probably there's no case for that at all, but it did worry you at the time. It did worry you that somebody might have you in their sights, so to speak.
Well, let's talk about that, but there's a couple of things you've raised there, because for me, my entree into this was unsolved homicides, and I became aware on the north coast of New South Wales that there were a number of unsolved homicides and disappearances where coronial inquests and the police had found foul play, and that number has exploded really over the last sort of 10 years of me doing the research, to the point now where we're talking about 70 or nearly 80 young, and I've only really been looking at young women who disappeared in that period from the 70s and 80s and 90s. But what's profoundly affecting for me in that is talking to families and hearing the testimony of people who don't have a resolution, who don't have a someone brought to justice. They never even find a body. It's just someone disappeared. And for those families, they never recover. Those families and friends, they never recover. And to that point, beyond the 7 murders in Belangolo, I think Superintendent Clive Small ended up saying that he thought there was one other murder that of a young man in Oberon that he thought that Milat was strongly linked to. Do you think that Milat was responsible for other murders? That he contained his violence and his spree of mayhem to that 1989 to sort of 1992 period, or do you think that it's highly likely he's responsible for other murders?
Yeah, I think there is a strong possibility that he was involved in other murders, and as you say, Clive Small reckons he might have been involved in the death of that young man in Oberon in the Blue Mountains. And he also said to me that he thought there could be a couple of other people that might have been a victim of Ivan Milat. There was a lot of speculation at the time that Milat might have been involved in dozens of murders. Clive Small always refuted that. He said, no, not at all. But
because there was a cluster of murders in the late 70s, or disappearances. I misspoke there. Disappearances in the late 1970s, early 1980s in the Newcastle area, wasn't there? Which was an area that Milat had frequented.
Certainly Milat had worked there on the Roads and Traffic Authority. He'd gone there to do road repairs in the Newcastle area. And while he was there, a number of young women did disappear. Now, there's no evidence to say that he did it, but there's strong speculation that he might have been involved. And certainly I think, the feeling generally is that, he had the capacity to kill the backpackers, then he almost certainly had the capacity to kill other people around that time, or perhaps a little earlier.
And also there was clearly the strong inference that there were other people involved, that there had been 2 guns used, 2 different MOs, that overpowering people on your own could be, problematic, and that, of course, only one person was ever convicted. So there is the possibility that person, remains at large and could have been responsible for other murders.
2 answers to that, really. I mean, I asked Clive Small about this very point, about the case for a second killer, and he rejected it. He said no. So I said to him, raise the point that you've just raised about, you might need 2 people. You've got to overpower 2 people, rather. How does one person do that? And he said, well, quite easy, really. You just get one of the pair to tie up the other one's hands, and then when the other one's tied up, you tie up the second one. And he described it as quite a simple manoeuvre, even though the original person might have had loosely tied hands. Then the killer would go back and tighten them further.
Was it ever raised in the case the possibility that the people were drugged, that they may have been offered, a drink or of that? Because I know with the disappearance of the 2 women from the Tollgate Hotel in Parramatta, where Milat and another person, that it was suggested that might have been Milat and another person there, that the women seemed drugged. They'd been seen, 2 men had been seen putting 2 young women into the car that were never seen again. They seemed drugged. They were floppy. They were being dressed, as it were. Was that ever a suggestion in the court case that Milat may have relied on drugs? Was there any physical or DNA evidence any autopsy evidence, that suggested that?
I never came across that. And of course, Milat was a fairly clean living individual in terms of drugs and drink and that sort of thing. He didn't take alcohol. No evidence he took drugs, cannabis or anything else, He was quite clean living and lived a fairly healthy life.
Yeah, it's quite an extraordinary thing. Milat was like a neat freak. And it's a strange, another sort of split, suggests a split personality, to have someone who's a neat freak, someone who doesn't drink, doesn't take drugs, well-dressed, always groomed, is then involved in a homicidal, frenzied stabbing attack. Yeah. It does suggest that potentially someone else involved.
Yeah, it does. And he was also quite meticulous in everything he did as well. And
Kept his cars beautifully clean,
Indeed.
maintained them.
he had a Harley Davidson motorbike, which he would polish every Sunday morning and on his driveway. And Clive Small told me a fascinating story that on one occasion he was talking about Milat's ex-wife, and he told this story about how Milat had come home one day to find that a glass coffee table had been broken in the house, and all the glass was on the floor. The wife had accidentally knocked it over during the course of the day. Milat didn't ask her to clear it up, but he made her look at every segment of glass for days on end afterwards to remind her of what she'd done, rather than getting her to clear it up. And that was all part of his controlling aspect. You know, he liked to tell people what to do and to make sure they did it his way.
It's interesting. Milat's personal life, he did have long-term relationships, but they were abusive, weren't they? And he did have, he was married, I think, a couple of times, but he ended up, those fell apart, and he was certainly coercive and abusive, wasn't he, to the women in his lives?
Oh, most certainly, yeah. I mean, his ex-wife, Karen, she changed her surname completely and has never spoken about it afterwards, has never been capable of talking about the relationship she had with Ivan Milat, for understandable reasons. It must have been an horrific time.
What about him socially? Like, did Milat... was there any of that? Was there any evidence? Was that part of the profile that was built of him in the court case, where he spent his time? Because he was clearly very embedded in his large, immigrant family. They spent a lot of time together. But was he a lone wolf, a Sigma? Was he a social person? Did he go out? Did he have many friends other than his family members?
No, I think he never went to the pub, that sort of thing. Because he didn't drink, but that didn't appeal to him, going to the pub with mates and having a pint of beer. And I know when he was on the road gangs, mending the roads, his fellow workers used to say he'd just go back to his motel in the evening and read a do-it-yourself magazine or something like that, rather than go out and get drunk or anything like that. So, yeah, I mean, he was very reclusive in that respect, except when he came to his family. And then, of course, he liked going back to see his mum, and he enjoyed going out with his brothers, hunting, shooting, whatever the case might be. So he was very family-oriented in that respect, but not at a major social level when it came to other friends or working colleagues.
The end for Milat was in terms of his criminal career was the conviction. He ends up in Maitland Jail. He turns up first day, gets smashed in the face a few times by the locals, who a very warm welcome, a fitting welcome. But Milat in jail. Tell us about that.
Well, when he was then later transferred to Goulburn Prison, the maximum security wing in Goulburn, he lived a very unpleasant existence, you have to say. He was in solitary confinement for 20 years or more. He hardly met anybody. He hardly talked to anybody. He was only let out of his jail cell for an hour or two a day just to do a bit of exercise. He had had a television. He had a sandwich maker, toaster, and that was about it, really. So he was allowed to listen to the radio and the TV, wasn't allowed to read any books that had been written about the backpacker murders, although he was allowed to go to the library occasionally and take a book from the prison library. And he had a very austere existence in terms of what he ate. He didn't eat much. He had Weetabix for breakfast, and he was just getting basic prison food all the time. And I think probably that affected his health over a period of 20 years or more.
And so he's in prison, but he protests his innocence the whole time. There was never at any point, any concession, any admission at all. The whole time he's saying, I've been framed up, I've been set up by the police or set up by someone else. And he continues to protest his innocence and actually tries to mount a few legal challenges to his conviction.
On a number of occasions he makes appeals on various aspects of the case that he believed should have gone in his favour. But I after my second book was written, I managed to maintain a certain sort of letter correspondence with Ivan, and I was able to ask him a few things about the case. Of course, he always denied his involvement in the case. I mean, there was no way that he was going to admit his guilt. But I put to him, because I had a fairly encyclopedic knowledge of the case and the evidence and all that sort of thing, and I put to him various things. I said, "Doesn't this prove your guilt, Ivan?" One of them was the fact that there was a photograph produced during the court case of Ivan's then girlfriend wearing a T-shirt that had belonged to Joanne Walters or Caroline Clark.
The Benetton T-shirt.
The Benetton T-shirt. And I said, well, if you weren't responsible for these killings, how come your girlfriend was wearing one of the victims' T-shirts?
What a macabre thing to do.
I know.
To give the person you love, this memento.
And he said, oh, it's quite easy to explain, he said. She bought it at Camden Markets. And just happened to be there on the stand, and she bought it at Camden Markets, and that's why she was wearing it.
That was his defence the whole way through. Like I read his testimony. He just said, "I don't know. How did the guns get there? Don't know. How did all these where did these backpacks turn up? Oh, they must have got it from someone else. I don't know. They came from the Guildford house. He never had a plausible explanation for any of that." Did he ever in that correspondence or during it? Because I know at the beginning of your book you talk about some of the conspiracy theories. There was a suggestion that Milat may have been part of a bigger network, or the other parties that may have been there may have been part of a bigger network. Did he ever go into any of those conspiracies about who did him in, or some of the wider implications of his crimes?
No, he didn't. He never went into that area at all. I was able to put to him things like, there's been a lot of discussion that there was a second person involved in these killings, Ivan. What do you make of that? And he said, well, I don't know. I wasn't there. I haven't a clue. And
so he was bound by the fact that he's saying, I wasn't there, so he couldn't put anyone else in.
No, that's right.
Do you think it's possible that he... it's possible that it was one of his family members, so he's not going to suggest that, or someone else he was closely attached to?
Very hard question to answer, because at the end of the day we don't know. I mean, we can theorise about these things. We can speculate.
Because there was a statement made by Richard Milat, wasn't there? Who said that stabbing someone or cutting someone is like stabbing a loaf of bread, which sort of suggested, some sort of level of knowledge or participation even.
Yeah. Well, I don't really want to go into the guilt or innocence or whatever, about other members of his family, because we don't know at the end of the day. We don't want to defame anybody or anything like that. So I just think that there's certain things we will never really... We can speculate, of course, and that comment you've just made about the bread, that does suggest something in people's minds. But again, there's no proof. It's just one person's word against another. And so far as the serial killer business is concerned, again, I asked Milat, the business about, why would a serial killer use different modes of killing, such as guns and knives? Why doesn't a serial killer always use the same way to dispatch his victims? And he said, well, I don't know, I'm not a serial killer, so I wouldn't know those sort of things, And it just went on and on like this. Having said that, we covered an enormous amount of area over a number of years, in actual fact. And what did strike me was that he was a clever man. He was very lucid. Although he didn't receive a particularly good education, he wrote a good letter. He wrote very legibly, grammatically correct. And he had a wide interest in what was going on in the world. And sometimes he would stray into things he'd just seen on the TV. and he would say, "Wow, what about climate change, or what about this, and what about something had happened? The death of Steve Jobs, the Apple man." All these, he'd suddenly sort of go off on a tangent and talk about these people who he'd heard on the radio or the TV. And bear in mind too that he grew up in he'd been imprisoned since the start of the internet world. He got to prison in '94 after his arrest, and he didn't really know much about emails or the internet. So he was getting all his information from the television, listening to the TV, or viewing the TV, or listening to the radio. But he had a very encyclopedic knowledge of what was going on in the world, and he was interested in what was going on in the world. So he didn't let the backpacker murders fester all the time, or the case. I suppose he did it to keep himself going. You know, he had to find other interests, you know, to broaden his attitude and to find out what was going on.
At this time, he's in Australia's most secure prison. He's in the Goulburn Supermax. He's in isolation. There's no opportunity really for him to talk to other prisoners, and I think his family stood by him through most of it, and some of his family did through most of it. He got infrequent visitors, but so there's no opportunity for him to disclose to other prisoners. But part of your book I wanted to raise that I think's quite chilling is you spoke to a fellow called Noel Manning back in the 1990s. Noel Manning is it Noel or Neil? Sorry. Noel Manning. He had been a cellmate of Ivan in the 1970s when Milat was charged with the first rapes and abductions. And Noel Manning had some incredible things to say, didn't he?
Yeah, Noel Manning told me about sharing a cell with Ivan, and he used to say Ivan always kept himself incredibly fit. He'd do press-ups on the floor all the time, and building up his body, his muscles and shoulder muscles and arms and legs, and he was worried about being in a cell with Ivan.
He was worried. I think Noel Manning. He was worried about being in a cell with Ivan Milat.
Yeah,
I mean.
But at that particular point...
I think rightly so.
But at that point, of course, we didn't know what he was capable of in terms of the backpacker murders. We're talking about, as you say, the 1970s. And he wanted to tell me, Noel Manning wanted to tell me about something he alleged had happened involving the government of the day, and how he'd been warned off, talking about certain things in connection with Milat, and warned that if he did reveal anything publicly, then he might get back to jail and might find himself in a prison cell with Ivan Milat again, who was by that time in custody. It was a very curious conversation, and in true sort of spy style, we didn't know each other. He got in contact with me. I said, "Where shall I meet you?" And he said, "Well, let's meet in North Sydney near the football ground there." And I said, "Well, I'll bring a copy of the Times with me just to identify who I was."
Really? Were you wearing a trench coat?
Not quite.
In the middle of a Sydney summer, a trench coat and the Times.
It was a very curious period in my journalistic career.
But Manning spent a considerable amount of time in the cell with Ivan, and Ivan made some disclosures. He boasted, didn't he?
He did boast about the number of kids he'd pick up in the cross, and the number of times he'd had sex with these kids and all that sort of thing. So yeah, he told him about that,
and also how he'd killed them too.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, but again, you don't know to what extent Noel Manning was making all this up for his own benefit in some way or other. So you have to take everything with a pinch of salt there. But curiously, at the end of this period of time, went over a period of weeks, if not months, Noel Manning mysteriously died. I thought, what's going on here? And I went to the coroner's office, which was then in Parramatta Road, to look up the cause of death, etc. And apparently he'd committed suicide. Why did he commit suicide? Was it suicide? Was it something else? Again, it just added to the paranoia associated with the backpacker
Because
murder case.
this was just prior to the court case, wasn't it? And Manning may well have been a witness.
He may well have, exactly. He may well have been prepared to go to court.
And he was saying he was being warned off from making, giving evidence. And part of that was he was alleging that Milat had said, look, I've killed a lot of people. I do it in all these gruesome ways. And he was, if I'm not wrong, describing a very similar manner of murdering someone as to, and this is in 1975, as we saw with the Belangolo murders 20 years later.
Yeah. Well, he demonstrated, obviously, that he was capable of doing that sort of thing. Whether he went into as much detail as we know about the backpacker murders, I'm not quite sure. But certainly, he demonstrated that he was capable of such acts.
I think one of the interesting things that comes out of that was that Milat was working in King's Cross, that he was working on the King's Cross tunnel, that Manning says that that Milat boasted that he got so big and strong by using a jackhammer on the King's Cross tunnel, and that gave him, working in the city, gave him access to young people and the like.
Yeah. So it did all add up. It did all add up that, he might have come in contact with young tourists at that stage, or, just kids, who were, a bit ne'er-do-well and during that period, going through a crisis of their own. So it did illustrate the point that he may have started his interest in that sort of assault, that sort of attack, 10 or 20 years earlier.
And the cross was an interesting, because, I've never been able to sort of establish through any of the evidence who were the last people to see the backpackers. Apart from Simone Schmiedel, I think, who was staying in Guildford, all of the other backpackers were last seen in inner Sydney.
Yeah, certainly I think...
None of them were actually seen on a highway hitchhiking. They all set out from youth hostels in inner Sydney, in the King's Cross.
Yeah, the German couple, the man and his girlfriend, they'd certainly been in the King's Cross area of Sydney, and they'd rung a member of their family back in Germany a day or two before they departed Sydney, and the parents detected a certain level of concern in the backpacker's voice, as though he was a bit frightened of something or a bit sort of unhappy about something, but they never really got to the bottom of it. So yeah, there is evidence to suggest they had spent a bit of time in Sydney before they actually left on their travels. But most of them, as I say, took that train out to Casula, and then began their backpacking and their hitchhiking from there.
But is there evidence of that? Was there ever a train ticket? Did anyone ever see them in Casula? This is the key thing. Where was the last place that the backpackers were seen? Was it on the Hume Highway? Was it Paul Onions? Certainly was approached by Milat there, but where was the last place the backpackers were seen?
Well, we can only theorise on this, and as I said earlier...
But how can that be that we can only theorise?
Well, because they were with friends. They had been with friends in the city. They'd known other backpackers. They had a group of friends. They would talk about what their plans were.
But surely they would have checked out of a hostel, because I read Clive Small's book, and he said that that two of the backpackers were visiting friends in Surrey Hills and then set out by road, which is a sort of quite obtuse way to, you would think that someone would say, they stayed with me and they left here at 8:42 and they hopped in a cab, or they said we're catching bus X or the rest. It seems strange to me that we're unable to pin down exactly where these people were last seen. Is it possible that Ivan Milat was approaching these people in the inner city at the actual hostels, that, like Paul Onions, who's standing at a newsagent, hot in the sun in Liverpool with a gigantic backpack on, they stood out like a sore thumb, that they would be an easy target for someone to walk up and say, hey, are you guys, looking for a lift? I'm heading to XYZ. Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, it is a possibility, but I suppose, does it really matter at the end of the day? Does it matter where they were picked up? They might have been picked up in Casula, they might have been picked up at King's Cross, but it doesn't really indicate anything more than that very fact. They're where they set off on their journey and who might have known them, beforehand. I think, generally speaking, they would have, if they'd been in a backpackers hostel, they would have spoken with friends. They would have talked about their travel plans. And I think in the case of one, certainly I remember in the case of one of the backpackers, they mischievously stayed in one of the backpacker resorts in King's Cross one night without registering, so they wouldn't have to pay a fee. And they'd gone up early in the morning to start their travels long before breakfast time, so that they wouldn't be caught. There was a lot of sort of jiggery-pokery, if you like, about their departure from Sydney. Some did it to avoid an extra night's accommodation. Some people took a train to avoid paying for a full train ticket. Lots of different motivations. But I don't think they really added to the story as such, or Ivan Milat's motives. If he picked them up at King's Cross or Casula or wherever, doesn't really matter. It's what he did at the end and what his plans were to kill them in the Belanglo State Forest.
So Milat dies in 2019 from cancer, and he takes to the grave any admission. He never says, "I'm guilty." Do you think it's an act of a coward to do that, like a final disgrace that he doesn't give these families the justice and the certainty that they're about what happened to their kids?
Curiously, I think Ivan Milat had spent so much time trying to win his freedom, trying to prove his innocence, that he'd convinced himself that he didn't do it. He'd stuck that part of his life away in some locked up box in his mind. I think he'd persuaded himself that there's nothing to do with me and just ignored all the publicity that surrounded the backpacker murders and his involvement in it, and just carried on trying to prove his innocence. And I think that's what it comes down to. He was he was never going to admit it, and he said that to me in effect in his letters. And
have you ever thought to publish those letters?
I have, but not so far. Well, it hasn't happened so far, let's say that. I think there's a certain, I have my own reasons for not doing so at this stage, but it may happen at some time in the future.
Okay, fascinating. Well, look, Roger Maynard, thank you so much for coming into the weeds and dealing again with an incredibly compelling and difficult subject. We very much appreciate it. I will have to get you back on to talk about the Peter Falconio, Joanne Lee's issue, if you're up for it, because, again, another interesting true crime story in Australian history that has a lot of question marks about it. But thank you for the work you did over a very, very long time. I think you were key to highlighting these crimes, may well have been fundamental to bringing Ivan Milat to justice, and it must have taken a toll. And so for that, thank you very much.
Well, it's kind of you to say that, but I would also remind you that there are other people too out there reporting on the same subject, and that I was just one of many people who were trying to get to the bottom of this story and to get to the truth. So I don't want to overestimate my importance in it.
No, but you're very humble. I mean, you were the one that saw that little story in the afternoon telly, and there must have been just a ting, like the hairs on the back of your neck go up, because you must have a good sense for these things, because it certainly turned into the crime of the century in Australia, something that attracted attention around the world. So thanks again for the work you've done. Thank you for taking the time to come into the weeds. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Everyone, if you like that, like and subscribe. We'll be back with more Into the Weeds soon.